Well, my buttercups, welcome back to another episode of Topic Discuss. I've had some requests to go back to the Xi Jinping video, and I'll put a link up here. I think I'll put a link up there when I get a chance to. So you can go back and watch that. We really were just talking about 2022 Olympics. I mentioned some things about the geopolitical consequences of that work that Xi Jinping was trying to accomplish, and whether we think that he accomplished what he was setting out to do geopolitically. A lot has changed that we're going to have to add into that discussion, including the Ukrainian war, and we need to talk about what the world looks like post-pandemic. I would suggest, or I think that I'm predicting, if you will, that the old world order, or the way that the economic world globally worked, has really been completely disheveled and is pretty much over. And so with that hypothesis, we're going to talk about what the new world order will look like, what the future will look like, and I am going to also hypothesize, or my thesis includes, that the future will be completely geopolitically centered on space. When I say space, I'm talking about from the Earth to the Moon to the asteroid belt. So buckle up, buttercups. It's another episode of Topic Discuss. Welcome to our show on the centrality of space. And as usual, I just want to invite all of you to participate in the Buttercups program. You can join Topic Discuss as a member. It just kind of helps keep things moving along, and kind of, I think, is motivating. When people are joining, it is a little bit motivating to continue to make content. So anyway, I'd love it if you would join. There are 3 different levels you can join, and they will give you different perks. They'll also give you different names, like you can be Butters, or you can be Cups, or you can be a full-fledged Buttercup. Don't forget to subscribe. I have had a few people ask me, why is it that I need to know when your new content is coming out, and it really, that happens because you haven't clicked the subscribe button. So you need to do that. And I also appreciate any likes that you click on, because that also helps with my algorithm. And then what I've been learning really helps with the algorithm is if you share it to Facebook, if you have a Facebook. So with that said, we're going to talk about a lot of different things. I had made a video, and I'll try to, either I did it in the intro or I'll put it here, a link out to my Winter 2002 Olympics broadcast, where we really talked about the geopolitical consequences, what Xi Jinping was trying to do, similar to what Hitler's done in other countries, really, but specifically what authoritarian leaders attempt to do. And we're going to talk about this through the rest of the show tonight, is that they want to essentially find ways to maintain their power and remain in control. Xi Jinping is up for I'm going to blank on the name of this. In the fall of 22, there is, even though there's not really elections, there still are rings of or circles of power below Xi Jinping in the Chinese Communist Party. It is a one-party government, so it's very authoritarian. But some of those inner rings can be, if they don't like Xi Jinping, then they can actually how, dethrone him, if you will, and put in a different premier or president. So I had just mentioned in my last video that maybe we would see whatever happens with the Olympics is going to have a big determination on how these lower councils or these lower governing structures will view Xi Jinping. So let's get into maybe how that looked for him. So in our slide presentation, if you want to watch, if you're not watching, then I'll talk through each slide, so you don't actually have to watch if you're listening to this over the podcast. If you're watching live, this is you'll see our slide deck here. But so you can see that the Winter Olympics was successful in terms of like the venue and all those kinds of things. However, whether Xi Jinping liked this or not, the Olympics has been completely overshadowed by COVID. So just a little bit of background and history there. China has had a very challenging resurgence of COVID because of their vaccination strategy. So they did not participate with the rest of the world on a vaccine strategy. They did not participate with Moderna or Pfizer. They created their own vaccine, which is true to form for an authoritarian government. And so it didn't work. It wasn't a broad enough to deal with the fact that you would see additional mutations, and that those additional mutations would also need to be dealt with within the vaccine. So it just wasn't broad enough, and so the vaccination, even though they may have had a high vaccination rate in their populated cities, they still had relatively low compliance in their rural areas, and they also didn't have really any protection against the Delta and other variants. And so that has really left China in probably one of the worst places in the world in terms of amongst the worst in terms of this pandemic. So in contrast to the United States, despite I think sometimes what happens when you live in the United States, like myself and friends and family around me, is you do get pretty myopic. You hear about all the challenges we're facing within the United States, including low vaccination rates by our standards. However, globally, the United States has a relatively high vaccination rate, even with boosters, um, uh, especially when compared to countries like Russia and China. So this has left China in very, very bad shape related to the pandemic. So they have, as a result, implemented, and we're actually moving into the fifth week of their most strictest and severe lockdowns. So the Chinese Vice Premier Sun Chunlan implemented a policy forcing everyone who tests positive for COVID, without exception or delay or deduction, to be moved into a it's like a decontamination camp. What is it called? Oh, it's they're isolated while a crew of cleaners come in and clean their space, and there's no, like, you can't, it's totally authoritarian, so you can't choose whether you're going to go to this uh, this location that isolates you or quarantines you. They're I forget what they're calling them in China, but you're quarantined in a different location. Someone comes in and cleans your space, your house, your apartment, or whatever, and then I don't know how quickly you can go back. But you're quarantined, but you're forced to quarantine in one of these locations. Just taking a drink of my Coke Zero here. So that has created some interesting dynamics with the Chinese economy, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But I think the pandemic, because of that and the Ukrainian war, we have seen some significant changes or impacts economically. So the major problem with authoritarian regimes or authoritarian governments is that um, the way that they will respond geopolitically is typically um, self-defeating and self-destructive. So the way that China's responded to the war and economic downturn has always has a common root, and this is true for most authoritarian countries or governments. So there always has to be a public display of yellow swag or yellow swag, like we are doing great, and we you should have FOMO because you're not us. But that's not really what's happening. There's an obsession internally to control narratives, control environments, control minds and people. And then obviously there's usually chronically dubious results and outcomes in authoritarian regimes. And that's what we're seeing in China. So just kind of to give a little bit of history, because I think that some of my viewers or some of my fans and buttercups have a deep rooted fear in China. And I want to do a little myth busting for those who have this fear of China taking over the world and where that came from. So there, in well, so we saw China really reform its economic policies in the 1978, and this was due to the death of Mao Zedong. And that's again what we see in authoritarian governments, is that there is a one leader that people continue to kind of either worship or keep in power. That leader also keeps themselves in power, but through propaganda and making their people think that they're doing great things. But usually what happens when it takes death, first of all, to remove authoritarian leaders, so they stay in power for a long time. When that happened with China in 1978, there was new leadership, which I won't spend time on, just because that's a whole other podcast. But that resulted in economic reform in China, specifically around um, growth strategies internally, manufacturing and industrialization, which really was profound for China, and it allowed them to grow very quickly in terms of their economic growth and GDP. Their population was also booming, and so China has always kind of been this sleeping dragon economically and geopolitically. And so one of the things that happened post World War II, and really through the Cold War, is the United States became the economic engine, if you will, of the world. This new global order really meant that if you want to participate in the global economy, then you need to follow the United States rules. And when you do that, then the United States will protect you militarily, right? So we saw throughout Southeast Asia continued military forces building up along those sea trade routes. I can remember one of the first times I went to Singapore, I saw two United States aircraft carriers parked outside the island, and I thought, what this is? It was really odd for me to see, just because it looked like such a big military display. And by the way, aircraft carriers are kind of like the star destroyers of our planet. No other country has the amount that we do. No other country has these aircraft carriers or in all locations of the earth that we can deploy immediately. So there's a significant force, and a lot of this is true and has happened because of this kind of global agreement that happened throughout the Cold War to say, okay, yeah, we want to participate in the global order economically, so we're going to rely on or even pay the United States to manage our defenses, so we don't have to spend money on defense. We can spend money on infrastructure and industrialization and raise the living wage and our GDP as a country. I'm taking another drink. So what's interesting, and we're live, so I don't edit out my Coke Zero drinking. But so when we think about that happening and that kind of like lays the groundwork or the background for why we see the United States with the military position that it has, and where that came from. And China really benefited from that, especially post 1978. And but it wasn't really until the World Trade Organization, under the leadership of Bill Clinton, you can see here a picture of him, that we saw the opportunity for China to really explode economically. Now, that was intentional on the part of the United States. It was intentional, on intentional by this first world order, or first world countries, which we're going to talk about in a minute what those mean. Because there was a recognition that China was emerging, an emerging economy and an emerging country that could really be beneficial. China wanted to participate in this global economy, and so there was a mutual agreement to make them part of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which even propelled their economy forward even faster, their GDP especially. The problem, though, is that, and by the way, so that happened, I think, I don't know, in the 90s. And well, it was with Bill Clinton, so it would have been in the 90s. And I can remember, as a young person who was very apolitical, I didn't really care about politics. I would hear family members and friends just freaking out about China. China's going to take over. Look at their GDP. It was really growing. Their economic growth was, 7, 8, 9% per year. So it just kept going. And so the predictions, if you did some statistically, predictive models, you would see that they would take over the United States GDP, which was concerning to people. But the problem that actually occurred, so reality is, once we hit 2010, so we saw this continued growth, but there were still internal authoritarian problems. And you're going to hear me really hammer on authoritarianism and authoritarian governments, because I think gone are the days where we're talking about capitalism versus, versus communism. I think that, again, I think those are world order ideas that come post World War II and Cold War era that are now dead and gone. We're really talking about authoritarian regimes and authoritarian governments, versus liberal democracies, and I'll get into that in a minute. So so these external forces really propelled China forward, and internal leadership took advantage of that, and they didn't really think beyond what would be required to continue that kind of growth. There was just, because it was lasting so long, year after year, the Chinese were experiencing this incredible growth. The era from 1978 to 2010 actually saw the greatest number of Chinese people lifted out of poverty, which was just significant, right? And so, yet these authoritarian regimes that continued to remain in place, that wanted to dabble in capitalism and liberal democracy. Liberal democracy really includes the government being liberal with its intellectual property. So in the United States, for example, when I talk about liberal democracy in the United States, for example, if the United States is investing in the Department of Defense for innovation, research, and development, the new IP that comes out of those efforts can be privatized and sent out into the private sector, and the private sector can then really accelerate what happens to that IP. NASA's a good example of that. When the Obama administration, NASA's not really a great example because that's not necessarily IP, but all the infrastructure of space under the Obama administration, that was moved over to the private sector, and that's going to lead us to further discussion on the centrality of space later in this podcast. But China couldn't quite get the Chinese regimes, these authoritarian regimes, couldn't quite allow that kind of thing to happen, because they wanted to maintain this governmental control through whatever means they could, right? either by really by just making the state and a single leader uh, um, kind of the religion, if you will, and the person that you worship or the party that you worship. And so that never was resolved. And I think part of the reason for that, and I'm totally oversimplifying, is that the authoritarian leaders through these decades reap the benefits of the new world order, or of the world order, economic order, and um, just didn't could not recognize. And this is true for authoritarianism. It's difficult to recognize that your prosperity is not going to last. And when it starts to fade, what authoritarian regimes typically do is they look behind at the past to try to get back to how things used to be. They don't know how to look forward and prepare for a different world. And that really happened with China, because even though they had this really great growth, some of the policies they had internally were working. They still maintained authoritarian control over their banking system, specifically some of their heavy industrial sectors, energy, and intellectual property. And one of the things that I've heard people say, is that China will also steal the intellectual property of these private businesses that pop up. And that might be that's true. They don't have the same kind of intellectual property protections the United States has. But what I don't think people realize is what's more devastating to China is the fact that they not only do they not have protective laws for innovation in the private sector, but they don't have a big private sector, so that's not what really is impactful. What's the most impactful is that any IP that comes out of China's own governmental investments, banking investments into the banking industry, the energy industry is a good example. So if the Chinese government that really owns all energy production, no private enterprise is involved, then any new invention or R&D that comes out of the energy sector will be held kind of hoarded by the Chinese government. So that intellectual property never gets to the private sector. That's what's actually a deal killer for China. They didn't recognize that would be hurtful. So what happened in 2010 is the economy, this great growth that they were having of 9% or higher, just stalled and continued to stall even today. So 2010 was really, uh, and part of that is also because they really didn't have a way of managing the recession and moving beyond the recession. The recession kind of level set that kind of growth, the Great Recession of 2008, which we'll talk about a little bit later too. But I want to highlight for all of those out there who are fearful of China that are kind of these late Gen Zs or Gen Xers and early millennials who kind of grew up on the tail end. I mean, I didn't really grow up in the Cold War. I remember when the Berlin Wall fell. I was very young, but I remember that being on the news. I didn't really know what that meant. I just was told it's the fall of communism. But that era of people who are in the audience, I want to just give you some facts so that you can reset your thoughts about China. China is not in a position to be a global power in the future at all. There have been major errors, and authoritarianism is really the cause of those errors. So we'll move on. So China's challenge, and I just put a map up here to talk about um, the way that the World Bank and different global institutions look at the economics of different countries around the world. So China's economic growth continues to decline. The pandemic so remember 2010 it starts to slow. They continue to maintain authoritarianism in terms of state-owned energy. All energy is state-owned. All banks are state-owned. IP is all state-owned. And so then the pandemic hits, and I think just further puts the nail in the coffin for China. and then the Ukrainian war. Part of that is if you look at the map, you'll see that China's biggest land partner, like the land that they touch, that provides them important energy imports and exports, really energy exports, is Russia. So the Russian-Ukrainian war and all the sanctions that occurred due to that are really hurting China in terms of energy. So China's growth is targeted this year at 5%, and that's the lowest GDP growth, which is still growth. It's not a declination of growth, and these are numbers that don't come out of China. This comes out of deductions, that because we don't get really good information out of China. So when I say 5% growth, I'm talking about economists that are in the Western world that really kind of look at other indicators. So it could be lower than that. But because of that, the World Bank classifies China as middle to income level, even though they have the second largest economy in the world. They still are in that light green upper middle income, like Russia, like Brazil, many of the countries in South America, which is really interesting if you think about it. Again, if you still have this fearful mindset that China is a superpower, China is going to overtake the United States economically, and yet you see that China is still classified, despite its growth and the size, as upper middle income rather than high income. So it is still not in the same category as Europe, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, Canada, etc. So, authoritarian governance has resulted in IP to remain controlled by the state, and we'll move on from that whole concept. But I just want to hopefully myth bust some of these ideas that have come from the past related to China. So I want to take just a second. That previous slide, we talked about these income levels of countries. I used to think that is how you described a first world country, a second world country, and a third world country. I've learned, however, that the three world model came out of World War II, and really related to the winners of the war. And so the winners are considered the first world. So the United States and its allies, which you can see on this map, is Australia and Europe and Japan, and Israel, kind of there in the Middle East. And then the second world are all the countries that lost the Axis. And that doesn't mean necessarily that they are in worse economic condition or better, or even the same economic condition. It's just how the new world order that occurred post World War II resulted in this new nomenclature of first, second, and third world. Third world order were countries that really weren't involved or remained neutral. So the first world and the second world, the first world countries and second world countries remained locked in a Cold War post World War II until the 90s. So I'm hypothesizing, or in my thesis, you'll see that I'm suggesting that these world orders and these descriptions of first world, second world, third world countries is really over, and we'll talk about why in a minute. So the other thing that's happened is the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I want to talk about Ukraine. I'm not going to say that I can't predict what's going to happen post the war in Ukraine, about who will win or not. But what I will talk about is Russia, and what Russia's going to look like in the new world going forward. So USSR, through the post World War II and Cold War era, and I don't have time in this podcast to really talk about what happened in the Soviet Union during those years, but part of it, it's the same. It's similar to China. There was an ongoing, very long tradition of authoritarian rule. So again, you could say, well, it's communism that really is what, and for communism is what we use to label Russia or Soviet Union and China during these years. And again, you can see that in the previous slide, they were considered second world countries because they aligned themselves with communism. But I think for modern nomenclature, it's important to discard that old notion. It doesn't really exist anymore. What's more important to get our minds around that does exist is authoritarianism. So an authoritarian regime is really what we continue to see with one leader in the Soviet Union for a very long time. It takes someone to die to change your leadership. So either that happens through natural causes or someone knocks them off and kills them. So that's authoritarianism. There are other things that I'll state later about what authoritarianism is, but that again, same issues that we saw with China is that the Soviet Union just could not grow into the end of the 20th century and into the new 21st century because of their authoritarian policies. So the first real blow, so the Soviet Union starts to crumble. There are countries within the Soviet Union, Belarus and Ukraine, that start to want to secede from the Soviet Union and vote to remove themselves. And in the biggest blow to the fall of the Soviet Union was when Ukraine voted 91% popular referendum to secede from the Soviet Union. So the secession of Ukraine was a massive blow to Russia because economically, Ukraine was the second largest economic engine for the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War, which left Russia. And I remember this happening thinking, oh, hooray, Russia's communism's fell and now Russia's so naive of me to think this way, and naive for anyone else who thinks this way too, because yes, communism fell, but authoritarianism didn't disappear or die off. And Russia really was left in a state of disheveled corruption because they didn't have the economic engine that they used to have in Ukraine. They still had a good economic engine, but man, splitting off Ukraine and Ukraine becoming its own country was devastating for the Russian Federation. But this left a power vacuum in Russia post the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the regime, fall of the Soviet Union. So oligarch families that had benefited, from authoritarian economic policies started to fill in those gaps, and the Russian Orthodox Church also started to fill in those gaps, which resulted in social, economic, and ethnic instability. One of the things that's strange about this to me is the Russian Orthodox Christian Church, and religions also have a problem with authoritarianism because in this way specifically, religions have a difficult time. Major world religions almost never are capable of looking into the future to prepare for a new economic world order, because for many of them the future is the end of the world. That's kind of the religious motif. So religions have an authoritarian streak in that they will look back to a time when things were prosperous for them, and that's what they want to go back to, right? And so that's true for the Russian Orthodox Church. They have still today a big beef with the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. That goes all the way back to the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries of AD, and also from World War II, because the Roman Catholic Church allied with Hitler and really supported, and Italy, obviously with Mussolini, supported the Axis. So Nazism was very intertwined with the Catholic Church. So all this power vacuum leaves different types of authoritarianism to creep into Russia, to the Russian Federation. A democracy really didn't develop, even though that's what I believed, because I saw Russia change its flag to red, white, and blue, and I'm like, yes, they're going to be like capitalism. is going to save, or Russia's, uh, and as a Mormon, I thought the gospel is going to be preached and spread through Russia. And that was all really just naive. Power vacuum uh, left gaps that authoritarian regimes filled, from oligarch families to the Russian Orthodox Church. So the Russian Federation did remain in economic turmoil until 1999, when Yeltsin appointed Putin as his successor. So Putin was a KBG agent and leader, not leader, but he lived during the kind of the heyday, or the prime time of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union was considered powerful and strong globally, had a strong nuclear arsenal, right? And so from the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union really started in 89 and finalized in 90 or 91. So almost an entire decade of economic instability occurred in Russia, which is almost impossible to recover from. Not just economic instability, but political instability. So even though there was kind of supposedly a constitution, it didn't really protect an economic structure that would help propel Russia forward. So during that time, what a lot of people don't realize is that Russia did not invest in its people from an education perspective. And so there really was a loss of a full generation of really highly educated and skilled workers. You also have a lack of investment in their militaries. I know there's fear right now about the nuclear capabilities of Russia, which is a serious issue, but the rockets that need to be maintained and continuously invested in to launch these warheads were not maintained for over a decade. And so, and still many of them are not. So I think part of the fear that Russia has about using their nuclear arsenal, even some tactical nukes, is that they may, maybe they'll explode on Russia accidentally, because they just haven't kept the infrastructure up necessary to make those things viable. So Putin becomes the supreme leader in the year 2000. So just think about that as you think about authoritarianism. Putin is the leader of Russia for 22 years in some form or another, either as the supreme leader, or there was a small stint he was the prime minister, and he figured out how to make that stop so he could just be the supreme leader. 22 years. Think about that. And all throughout that time, because of his authoritarian nature and the authoritarian mindset he has, what that results in is, again, authoritarians don't look forward into trying to understand what the future could look like and how to innovate and disrupt to be part of that future. Authoritarians are more likely to look in the past, when they felt like their lives were really great and their country was really great, right? And so for Putin, that past was for initially some of the years of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union was considered a world superpower, but also he started to do his own kind of historical research, and countries have done this throughout throughout history. They look back historically to find kind of these legendary times when their nation or their country was kind of glorified, and maybe even create a new origin myth about their country, which is very much what Putin did. And so that resulted in, a contraction in Russia's economy, because the way that Putin knew he could stay in power was to not necessarily reform the Constitution or reform their economic model, but to placate the Russian oligarch families and the Russian Orthodox Church. Russia is literally a state sanctioned theocracy. So it is sanctioned its religion as the Russian Orthodox Church, the Christian Orthodox Church. Now, this is interesting because it's why you will see this very strange cognitive dissonance with conservatives in the United States who seem to really like Putin and Russia, and it's because conservatives in the United States like to also look back sometimes in history or and believe that religion is key to the success of a nation, which historically that is not true. And yet that's kind of a motif and also somewhat myth or origin myth about nation building, right? And so that's appealing to conservative kind of the conservative movement in the United States. If you kind of are wondering why that's happening, you'll notice that about what Putin has done in Russia with the Russian Orthodox Church, which includes also Putin saying gay people don't exist in Russia. That really makes conservatives excited in the United States. So that's why you see some of that cognitive dissonance happening. Why do conservatives who were in the Republican Party under Reagan were very hard on Russia and anti-Russia really, and now those same conservatives are in love with Putin, and that's why there's some common thread. So I want to talk about the demographic shift that we're also seeing. The baby boomers dominated population growth globally in all first world and second world countries post World War II, from China to Russia to the United States. Now, Putin's authoritarian regime and desire to make Russia great again, based on his outdated ideas or looking to the past, and maintain control through a single state religion, and also to not invest in public education, has caused a few problems with Russia's population. So I'll start there. So baby boomers today, and one of the reasons that we're seeing, or I'm hypothesizing, or my thesis about a new world order is due to the fact that the baby boomer population who have maintained the old world order, who have maintained the Cold War order for so long, and the policies around the Cold War post World War II order of things, they are dying out. The baby boomer population over the next 20 years or less will not exist anymore. So that leaves these countries to rely on the generations under them. The Generation X kids, that's a small population that is not going to be significant enough to create a new world order. So you know who's going to be left to really create the new world order, ironically, are millennials. And it's interesting because millennials are the generations that have been is the generation that has been vilified and demonized by the baby boomers, that they are too woke. That's that the millennials are too socially liberal. Millennials don't necessarily look back. So even people who are like conservatives that are millennials do not like to consider themselves millennials because of that motif that kind of fits with the millennial generation. But Russia's millennials and millennials are so here's some things to know about millennials. They are much more socially open. They are very supportive of human rights across the spectrum, right? And it really intolerant of closing off rights of marginalized groups. So that's one trait that millennials have that has really graded against baby boomer generations and graded against religions across the world. Now, religions and countries can continue to look to the past and try to make things the way that they used to be because that's what they think God wanted or that was better in the previous generation. Uh, in fact, I even had a baby boomer tell me recently that in a meeting that I need to listen to my elders because they know better than I do. And I'm just going to tell you, baby boomers, that that's never going to work with millennials because millennials will basically um, not listen to you and they will reject what you're saying even more. And they are our future. And millennials are much more progressive scientifically. Millennials understand the age of the internet and the data economy. They have they're tremendously more educated. And I put a little rocket there because millennials are going to take us to space. And I'll get to that in a minute. But because of this state-controlled authoritarianism and very conservative Christian religion, Russia's really experienced a brain drain uh, of their millennial population. So their millennial population almost doesn't really exist. So as baby boomers die out in Russia, there will not be a Russia like we know it. It will leave Russia in full and complete collapse. And amongst other things that I'll talk about in a minute. China is in a similar situation. Again, debunking the myth or your bias that China is a big threat. It's just not. We are also going to see the end of China very soon because China's baby boomer population is enormous. And they're moving into retirement, which the state is now going to have to fund. And when the state's funding your retirement population and there's not a base of workers that are consuming but continuing to consume and contribute, it's ripe for collapse. And then when that generation is gone dead, there is not a significant millennial population in China because of their population growth policies that really stymied or almost eliminated their millennial generation. The largest millennial generation, the largest millennial population exists, you guessed it, in the United States and Mexico. So we're going to talk about those two countries here in a minute. But because of that, the United States and Mexico will be in a very different position in the post-pandemic, post-recession, post-Ukrainian war geopolitical world. So millennials are our future. And just to recap, the decline of globalism, and I'm not, I have a hard time saying decline of globalism because in my heart, I'm a globalist only because socially, I want to make sure that we are not getting too nationalistic or tribalistic because that, for me, just my bias is that creates conflict that's unnecessary in the 21st century. So when I think of globalism, I think of, on more of a social landscape in terms of human rights, tolerance, and really lifting people across the world out of poverty. But globalism in this sense and geopolitically when I say that for this podcast, I'm referencing the post World War II Cold War era economic model. The first world countries, the second world countries, these two superpowers, the first and second world superpowers that really ran the geopolitical climate and globalism right up until we got into the 21st century. So what's accelerating really the end of that order, of the old world order of globalism, what started with the 2008 recession, really because the 2008 recession highlighted the fact that this economic order, this world order that had been established post-World War II, with the United States kind of managing the security of economic systems through its military across the globe, So despite the fact that there was this very powerful economic order that was protected and secured through the United States massive military that everyone agreed to build, including countries that paid for that, paid us to build or to deploy our military to secure their economic interests. The 2008 recession, the banking crisis, demonstrated that because of globalism and this global economy, when there is a crisis, especially in the United States, it hits the entire world. And our military could do obviously nothing about that. It wasn't, we did plenty through the Cold War era to use our military might to secure economic pathways and economic systems globally, but our military is not going to save us or save that economic world model through recessions, through bad economic policy, which is really what caused the 2008 recession. The military is not going to save us from the pandemic. And so 2008 recession highlighted this for specifically the United States. I think the United States recognized that there needed to be a change, that in order to manage and prepare for global catastrophes that no longer relate to global war, because we really kind of eliminated global war from World War II era due to this massive military that is managed by one country geopolitically. There really isn't a world war threat anymore. The United States recognizes this in 2008 and recognizes there are other global factors that are a bigger threat, global catastrophes, either climate change or pandemics or global recessions due to bad economic policy. So the United States began, in my thesis, re-industrializing through 2008 and beyond, and bringing production back into the United States from other countries, and not to a huge extent. That there was still some global tendencies to do that, but it became more and more important for the United States to rebuild things like their closest neighbors, Canada and Mexico, and the economic pathways and systems between those neighboring countries. So that the 2008 recession really kind of started that process of the declination of the old world order of globalization. And I believe the pandemic basically sealed that. I think that the 2008 recession might have caused a slow decline in the old world order of things, but the pandemic, I believe, basically accelerated us to the end of the old world order. The old world order of globalization is over. And the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, I think, just really highlights that it is over, that it has ended, because all of the mythology that we have built through the Cold War era about Russia's military and might and China's economic might have, like, the truth is out, that there is no such thing. There is no orthodoxy. It's made up. So Russia is not a military might. It is not a superpower. Its GDP is smaller than the state of Texas in the United States. It does not have a strong millennial workforce to take over for the baby boomers. That they've had significant brain drain, so they have no way to really build a consumer-driven economy. And how are they one way that countries that have a demographic problem can build a consumer centric economy, consumerism, is to entice people to come from other countries, entice immigrants that they want to move to their country. But that's no one's enticed to move to Russia, because you have to be in authoritarianism does not invite immigration. Right. And so there is no future for Russia. So what the Ukrainian and Russia conflict is showing is Putin as an authoritarian looking back into the past to in his mind, the way he's going to build the future of the world is looking into the past, not understanding the future economic challenges in front of us or geopolitical challenges, not recognizing what the 2008 recession really meant, as well as the pandemic. It did, and I think to some degree, Putin did understand what it would mean, and that's probably why he starts to think about how do I build Russia up again, and reindustrialize Russia. Well, one of the ways he thinks he should do that is through bringing Ukraine, Belarus back into Russia, not because he wants to create the old Soviet Union, but because he wants to bring these economic engines back into Russia that really was the downfall of Russia when Ukraine left. And so, but again, Putin's vision of reindustrialization is not like the United States vision, in that the United States is reindustrializing with forethought about what the future is going to look like with science and technology, and that is not what Putin is doing. Putin is looking into the past to reindustrialize. So there's no future in that. There's no future in a religious state governance model that enforces certain dogma and social constraints. That is not a reindustrialization model. It's a very rate limiting model, leaving your authoritarianism in the hands of a small group of powerful people, billionaires, oligarchs, and there is not a way to check and balance those those families or those groups. There's no future for Russia. And so, despite what might happen in Ukraine, we may see part of Ukraine become part of Russia, or Russia tries to control Ukraine, or there's just a decade-long conflict where Ukraine is constantly, trying to overthrow Russian tyranny. And one of the things that Russia has done in the past with Ukraine and countries around them is they've installed pro-Putin, pro-authoritarian leaders. They did that in the Ukraine. They attempted to do it in France. Not that they want to control France, but they don't want France to continue to push Western Western Europe ideologies in their direction. And this is what we saw in 2015 and 16 with Macron and the woman who was running against him. I forget her name, but she was really backed by Putin. It's the same thing we saw in the United States with Donald Trump and the fact that Donald Trump and his authoritarianism, and I don't know that Putin really thought to himself, well, Trump's an authoritarian, so I really want him in power. I know what Putin was more likely thinking is he's not from the establishment. He's not going to care about NATO like Hillary Clinton did, or Mitt Romney, or Barack Obama. If you remember when Barack Obama and Mitt Romney were debating, Mitt Romney recognized the problems happening in Russia and how Putin is building these through not war, but through propaganda and misinformation in political campaigns to install pro-Putin and pro-authoritarian leaders in these countries. And it would be a huge prize for Putin to do that to the United States. And so Putin, and really during that time, during the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, and Hillary Clinton used the State Department to really pressure Russia, sanction Russia, and keep Russia from expanding, to stop Russia from participating in other countries' elections through propaganda and coercion and corruption. And so when Zelensky was elected, that really, by major popular vote, that was a real blow to Putin, because his installed, authoritarian lookalike, was defeated, and so anyway. So somebody might say, I just heard a question. So, well, then why use military force? I can't really I can't really answer that question. I'm not sure. I think part of it, if I were to get to suggest an idea, is that Putin learned that a military force in a very limited way works. He did it in Crimea, and we didn't really get involved. And so what he does is he uses the military. If he can't use propaganda and corruption in a country's election to elect a pro-Putin or passive Putin leader, then his last ditch effort is to use military force to install a Putin friendly leader. And that's what I think happened with Ukraine. The propaganda was not working, and I'll explain to you, why this propaganda technique that worked for so long is now crumbling for all of these countries and political parties. So the propaganda, and I'll give you a little glimpse. It's because of space and because of our satellite systems that are proliferating throughout low Earth orbit. So space has really played a huge role in the Ukrainian conflict. It gave us information about Russia much earlier, and the world could highlight, because of our information, that the Biden administration and the United States use that information to tell the world that Russia is going to invade, even though Russia's propaganda, state propaganda, was, no, we're never going to invade. I don't know what they're talking about. We're just doing military training on the borders, right? And the propaganda machine that worked in the past in 2010, 2014, gave Putin a lot of leeway in overturning elections and installing Putin-friendly regimes and leaders. And when the Ukrainians, because of satellite technology, things like Starlink and other technologies, information becomes much more freely available. And the Ukrainian people have much better access under Zelensky's policies to information and to the internet, unlike Russia. And that really resulted in Ukraine, first of all, the United States revealing Russia's intentions early, and then also the Ukrainians really resisting the attack and not succumbing to these kind of election problems. They voted in a guy that was really popular. One of the reasons he got elected is using technology and the internet to overcome Russian propaganda. Macron was really good at that in terms of using the internet to overcome Russian propaganda that was intended to keep him from getting elected. Because he's not pro-Russian. The Democrats didn't do that very well with Hillary Clinton. Because we are just too far away to understand Russia's role and the fact that Russia is, very involved in propaganda to ensure that through election cycles, pro-Russian, pro-Putin, pro-authoritarian leaders get elected. So space has played a massive role in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, and the conflict has highlighted the fact that the military might of Russia's not what we thought it was. The economic engine is not what we thought it was. We also, I think that Putin thought that NATO had been sufficiently weakened, especially through the Trump administration. I had made a video when Trump was first elected many years ago, so I don't know if it's still on my channel, where I really talked about my fears about the Trump administration, specifically kind of going after and destabilizing NATO. Because it wasn't just that we were saying, well, you got to pay your fair share, and people have kind of fallen for that propaganda, like France, Germany need to pay their fair share. What really what he wanted, and people around him in his orbit wanted to basically dismantle NATO and no longer participate. In fact, it was in 2016 when President Trump became the Republican nominee. That means he becomes the leader of the Republican Party. The Republican Party rewrote or wrote into its platform, its political platform, to no longer support Ukraine, for example, which is a pro-Russian, pro-Putin idea and ideology, and it's still in the Republican platform today, it's still in the GOP platform. And so that's the kind of thing that we see happening. But that mechanism worked for baby boomers, the propaganda machine, and trying to use that machine to influence and overturn elections. It's not going to work for millennials, Gen Zs, and the new alpha generations, and what I'm going to call the Artemis generation. So so I think the Ukrainian conflict in some ways is just kind of showing baby boomers wanting to keep a world order that from a time past that doesn't work anymore, and that's what Russia's failure in Ukraine has really highlighted. And so we'll move on from oh, and one other thing I want to say about like the demise of Russia. So because of the Biden administration's way of providing information much earlier to the world that this Russian invasion was going to happen, the fact that Ukraine is such a large country and it is right on the edge of Western Europe, those Western Europe alliances, NATO did pull together. And you can criticize the Biden administration, and I have my own criticisms of the Biden administration, but this is one thing that administration, and I don't pin that just on Biden. It's the State Department and the fact that we have a functioning State Department, which we didn't under the Trump administration. Really worked with our allies to bring NATO together and reassure Germany that fully sanctioning Russia, because sanctioning Russia would mean Russia would also retaliate and stop oil, natural gas shipments to Germany, and Germany relies heavily on oil production and gas from Russia. And so what the Biden administration did is say to Germany, we will supply you natural gas. We have to ship it over the water. It's not as efficient. But and Germany could have said no. That's going to be too expensive, take too long. But Germany actually came through, and NATO came through and said, yeah, we're going to sanction Russia big time, sanction the hell out of Russia. And so that left Russia in even worse condition. Russia will not recover from this war. No matter what happens, there is no winning the Ukraine-Russian war. There is no winner. There really won't even be a winner for Ukraine. Ukraine is being devastated and cities are being destroyed. So there is no winner. There will not be a Ukraine winner or a Russian winner. There is no winner. This is just, I believe, a symptom of the total collapse of an old world order, the dying off of baby boomers, and we're going to see pockets of disruption like this. I think baby boomers, and I'm probably demonizing them, and I don't mean to do that, but this generation kind of authoritarianism, trying to hold on to power and hold on to the past that just doesn't exist. It's going to cause some disruption, but ultimately, it will result in the end of these authoritarian countries, the end of Russia, and the end of China. There is no China invading Taiwan. China, if that happened, China knows exactly what the United States would do. The United States has 2 aircraft carriers right in the middle of the Southeast Asian waters. And so any military attempt, even if we don't use our military to stop them from doing something with Taiwan, the sanctions that we can impose on China are so severe, because there's only, especially if we have really, like, if there's no more Russia, there is no other country for China to rely on or lean on in a powerful way, except maybe India. But still, the United States controls those waters militarily. China, even if China does attempt to do something with Taiwan, that will be more of just a symptom again of this collapse of the old world order, and not a trend going forward. And it won't really mean anything. No one will win. So here's the old Atlantic order, and I want to just kind of use this for a visual to kind of help people understand what I mean by these world orders. The old Atlantic Order, which was really what happened post World War II, it's where we got the nomenclature of a first world country, second world country, third world country. The new Atlantic Order resulted in these allies, which is all the countries in green that you see along the Atlantic Ocean. That's why I call it the Atlantic World Order. And we focused so much of the world order on the Atlantic. Whenever you see pictures of the globe, you'll see the Atlantic and the countries along the Atlantic. And so much of that is just kind of post-World War thinking, World War II. The United States, NATO, Western Europe, uh, and Israel, Japan, Australia, but really those Atlantic countries became the first world. Soviet Union, China, and what you see in yellow, the second world countries, and then any of the countries in red remained neutral. And this was something that really maintained the Cold War for a very long time. And I'm saying to you today that this old Atlantic world order that generations of people, mostly baby boomers, have relied on and understood as their worldview is no longer. This doesn't exist. This old Atlantic world order. And think about our politicians. How many of our politicians are in their 70s and have their minds stuck in this old world Atlantic order? Our parents, um, and those millennials and Gen Xers and Gen Z and Alphas, you'll recognize that this doesn't exist anymore. So I think some of your cognitive dissonance when you're listening to your parents or you're watching any kind of news outlets, especially Fox News, the cognitive dissonance is there because this Atlantic world order really doesn't exist anymore. But there's a whole bunch of old people that think it does. So I just want to also mention what Putin's trying to do in maintaining an old world order. I think maybe Putin understands that deglobalization is occurring, but his desire is to maintain a new or to create a new European order where Great Britain and the United States, they remain first world order, if you will. But Russia with Ukraine, Crimea, Belarus under its control in alliance with the Austrian-Hungary countries really creates this new European alliance. This is what Putin's trying to create. So you can see I have the Russian Federation there with Putin, the Austrian-Hungary idea under Viktor Orban's leadership as kind of this alliance, and then the United States and Western Europe. I don't think that necessarily Putin wants to create a military conflict between these two allies. This is just his view of how the future should look. People have asked me, well, so if Putin's trying to reach in the past to, create his new future, what's his idea of the future look like? And it's this, the Putin-Orban new European order. Viktor Orban is a total authoritarian. It's totally linked to Putin. Oddly enough, and I go back to the GOP and how this conservative movement of the United States and the Republican Party has really aligned itself well with authoritarian regimes. It's and one of the reasons I say that is because the Republican, I think the CPAC, a Republican political group, is having their annual meeting in Hungary with Viktor Orban as like a guest speaker. Viktor Orban, which is again, I think it's caused a cognitive dissonance for me too. But I wonder if that's a certain group of baby boomers in the United States who see Viktor Orban and Putin as aligning with their old values that really aren't irrelevant, that are irrelevant in the 21st century. So this is what the Putin Orban new European order looks like. This is the thing that Putin dreams about. I'm telling you, this is not going to happen. I just want you to know what's in Putin's, what I think is in Putin's head. Who am I? What do I know? So I want to present the new world order my thesis, my hypothesis about what a post pandemic, post 2008 recession, at 21st century um, new world order looks like. I'm calling it the Pacific Ring world order because and taking the focus off the Atlantic Ocean and on the Pacific, where the United States continues to lead with a massive millennial generation that is highly educated in the technical world and in science, healthcare, and medicine. Um, and so this new world order will be led by the United States. The United States also has the ability to sustain itself with all of its own natural resources. Unlike any other country, Russia can't do that, China can't do that. And we can provide our own energy. So the United States, for example, the president, one of the things that our president can do is ban exports of energy fuels like natural gas and oil to other countries. I think that's going to happen really soon because what that will do is stabilize our gas prices. We won't have to see there right now. Just the reason, just to give you a little background, there's a massive problem with supply chain of oil and natural gas because of the Ukrainian-Russian war and the sanctions that are happening. And so other countries that need our energy producing fuels, China and other countries throughout the world are really desperate for that energy producing fossil fuels, natural gas, oil. And so what will even hurt them worse is when the United States, in order to maintain and stabilize its own gas prices, and some of that will be done politically, as we go through political election cycles. But I predict that the United States is going to stop exports of its own fuel and keep all of its natural resources home, get natural gas and oil. Whether some of you will like that, some of you won't like that because you're worried about other countries. I'm just telling you that's probably what's going to happen, which will lower and stabilize our gas prices in the United States, but make that even more painful for the rest of the world, especially developing countries. So the United States, because of its millennial generation, because of its reindustrialization efforts that began back in 2008, and its investment in space and its investment in technology and intellectual property, will be this new leader of the Ring of Fire world order. Mexico and Canada will also be flanked as the two most important allies to the United States going forward. Due to the natural resources for energy production that Canada holds, and also the population of millennials that Mexico has. And if you've been to Mexico recently and talked to Mexicans that actually live there and have grown up there, they will talk about how, despite corruption that we know continues to exist in Mexico, the Mexican government is investing in education. And so not only is there a millennial workforce in Mexico, similar to the United States, they are also becoming more educated. Now, not as educated as the United States, but I predict, and the reason I have those three countries that are flanked together is the United States will rely very much on these neighbors due to the fact that we're just on the same continent. And what Canada will bring is natural resources, and Mexico will bring the labor resources in connection with what the United States already has. Japan, Singapore, and Australia will be part of this new world order, this new alliance economically across the Pacific. And that's why you'll see space programs where Japan is investing right along with the United States. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So I made a new flag for the new world order called the Ring of Fire. You see I put little flames around the 6 countries. that will make up our New World Order, with the United States star in the middle, flanked on either side of the United States, Mexico and Canada, with Japan and Singapore, and Australia, these oceanic countries surrounding the United States. So some people have asked me, well, what happens with Western Europe? Well, the way that I kind of think about Western Europe in this new model is no longer will the focus be on the Atlantic powers. The Western Europe powers will just be considered part of the United States power. Western Europe is going to be heavily dependent upon the new this Ring of Fire world order because of the natural resources that we will bring to them and security that we'll bring to them. They'll be important allies for us to continuously, for sure. I actually predict that the country that will rise up and lead Western Europe will be France. I think a lot of people have thought that was Germany. That's a whole other podcast that I can talk about, why I think France will emerge as that leader for Western Europe. But Western Europe, that's why I place Western Europe kind of under the United States in the Ring of Fire world order. So in this new world order that I hypothesize, there is a primary world and a middle world. And I say that because I don't, the old nomenclature of a first world country, second world country, third world country is over. There are now going to be primary world countries that are in that group of 6 countries, or there will be middle world countries. And this is a pretty stark difference from what we have been used to, that I think people are going to have a difficult time getting their minds around. Because what it really means is that our primary world order will be limited to just a few countries, whereas the rest of the world, there won't be second and third world countries. They'll all be middle world countries, and with some regional powers. So Russia, China, really almost will no longer exist unless they find ways to ally with regional powers or with the primary world order. So South America, all of the Middle East, Africa, India, and what will really signify the future for the primary world order, and what will differentiate the primary world order is the centrality of space, because the only countries that will have access to the economics of space will be primary world countries: Japan, the United States, Canada, Mexico, Singapore, and Australia. All other countries, all middle world countries, will access space if they can through the primary world order. And space is the only thing that will really matter economically going forward. The centrality of space is the signature component of our New World Order, the Pacific Ring, or the Ring of Fire New World Order going forward, because what space will afford us is a new reindustrialization of this new economic order. Because in order to truly reindustrialize the Ring of Fire and the countries that belong to this new economic order, space and the centrality of space will be front and center, if you will, for the new economic order. We've seen the evidence for this due to the infrastructure of space we already have. Satellites and the information that flows will become more and more important, and has shown to be the primary way that we will eliminate these propaganda machines from authoritarian regimes, even within our own country. So that is centered on space and space technology. We will also see through the Artemis mission, which is really led by the United States and its new Ring of Fire allies, i.e. Japan, Australia, the Artemis missions really are intended to build an entire infrastructure from the Earth to the moon. Now, I want to explain what that means really quickly, because it's more than just satellites. It's space stations that allow us to launch material into space that can either dock on space stations in near Earth orbit or on a space station orbiting the moon, and bring materials that can be used to build other space stations, private space stations around the Earth, space stations around the moon. And the reason that's important is because the primary inhibitor to building an infrastructure in space for manufacturing in space and industrializing space is the gravity. So lifting material off the Earth is the rate limiting factor, the cost and how difficult that is. So if we can spend the next 2 to 5 years launching rockets, and by the way, the reason we can do this, launch rockets weekly with material loads to build this infrastructure, is because of the work that we've done with reusable rockets with SpaceX. So that reusable rocket technology is really the accelerator to make space central to this new world order. And so over the next 5 to 10 years, maybe 20, an entire space infrastructure will exist, which will allow us then to build a moon base for the eventual purpose of manufacturing materials from the moon. And once we can do that, and that includes extracting water from water ice on the South Pole, it includes accessing rare earth elements that are found in the crust, and using regolith to actually make cement. We will literally begin manufacturing in space, which will alleviate the need to lift materials from the Earth to build the infrastructure of space. We will build the infrastructure of space from space materials, from the moon particularly, and the asteroids. So the reality is the new future of our new economic world, the new world order, led by the Ring of Fire countries, it is going to mean that there will be an entire inner solar system technological advancement scientifically, but also from resources. We will have access. The generation Alpha, some of my kids, I believe, will have access to important natural resources from the atmosphere of Venus, maybe even from Mercury, certainly from Mars, and definitely from the moon and the asteroid belt. So everything from the asteroid belt right into the sun, that entire inner solar system is going to be what our future is centered upon. It is the new future of our economic world order. It will only be accessible fully and built out through the new Ring of Fire New World Order, the Ring of Fire superpower. So that's the end of the presentation. It's kind of the end of this dialogue. I'll continue to come back and talk about the Ring of Fire New World Order, the Ring of Fire superpower. And I don't even think you could call it these things. I don't even think we can use those nomenclatures anymore, like superpowers, because there is no longer any other superpowers economically and militarily. That only is held by the United States. And it doesn't really matter anymore. It's still wonderful, not wonderful, but it'll still maintain security across the world. The United States military will continue to invest in the military, even more so to protect the Pacific Ocean for our economic lanes. But the other thing that we will be doing as a country is building out an entirely new security apparatus in space. So just like during the Cold War, we built, as the United States, an entire military that could be deployed in any ocean or any air space across the globe immediately. We're the only military in the world that has that capability. We have these big aircraft carriers that are deployed in every ocean. We will now do the same thing in space. So now think about space. The ocean is to the post-World War II New World or post-World War II order, as space will be to the new Pacific Ring world order. We will build an entire infrastructure of security, a security apparatus, Space Force, led by the United States, that will protect all of our assets in space, manufacturing in space, so that we don't have disruption from the middle countries that might have authoritarian regimes that might want to have access to these resources. So if you want to try to think, if you're a baby boomer and you're having a hard time getting your mind around this, rather think about what we did as a country to build out our water, our naval resources, our naval security, and air superiority. Now just think about that as space, outer space, from the near Earth orbit out to the moon, all the way to Mars, and throughout the entire inner solar system. And that is the future I predict. And so I hope you enjoyed our topics tonight. And I'm going to just tell you thank you for taking time. And I'm also going to say, peace out, buttercups.